They told you history was random, that progress was linear, that ancient myths were just stories from less evolved minds trying to make sense of lightning and stars. But what if the opposite was true? What if those ancient minds weren't confused? They were warning us, and we didn't listen. Hidden in dusty manuscripts and half-forgotten texts lies a pattern so precise, it reads less like prophecy and more like a blueprint. Hermeticism, the ancient science of the soul, didn't just whisper about the nature of reality. It mapped it. Encoded within it are predictions, 30 of them, that eerily mirror the times we're living through now. From the rise of soulless technology, to the collapse of spiritual wisdom, to the digital chaos overtaking human connection, each coincidence adds weight to the idea that maybe none of this is random. This isn't mysticism for mysticism's sake. This is what happens when we decode the messages left behind, and what you're about to hear changes everything. Long before the rise of modern religion, centuries before telescopes or microscopes, there was a figure known as Hermes Trismegistus. Not quite man, not quite myth. Hermes was said to be a fusion of the Egyptian god Thoth and the Greek god Hermes, a messenger of divine knowledge. From his teachings came the Hermetic tradition, a body of spiritual, philosophical, and metaphysical wisdom that would influence everything from alchemy to psychology and quietly shape the foundations of Western thought. But unlike the doctrines that demanded worship, Hermeticism never asked for belief. It asked for observation, to study, to test, to understand. Hermes spoke of the mind as the first force of creation, of the stars as reflections of the inner world, of cycles of rise and ruin that govern not just empires, but consciousness itself. He didn't just predict events, he described the forces that would inevitably bring them about. And over time, these teachings, powerful, dangerous, liberating, were pushed into the shadows. Not because they were false, but because they revealed too much. When we trace back through the surviving Hermetic texts, fragments from the Corpus Hermeticum, the Emerald Tablet, and the Asclepius, we don't find vague mystical riddles. We find warnings, 30 of them, scattered through allegory and cosmic law, speaking of a future where the sacred is mocked, where the divine spark within humanity is forgotten, and where truth is buried beneath distraction. A future that looks unsettlingly like our present. One of the earliest Hermetic predictions was that there would come a time when medicine would no longer treat the soul. Hermes spoke of a future where healing would be reduced to mechanics, organs, systems, chemicals, while the deeper wounds of the spirit would be ignored entirely. Look around. Antidepressants, anxiety meds, sleeplessness, addiction, symptoms of a world where pain is pacified, not understood. The prophecy didn't name Big Pharma, but it didn't have to. It warned us of a time when sickness would be profitable and healing inconvenient. Another prediction warned of the corruption of science. Not its failure, but its descent into arrogance, where only what could be measured would be accepted as real, and all things unseen would be dismissed as superstition. We now live in that exact era, where intuition is laughed at, where spirit is taboo, where mystery is ridiculed. And yet, some of the very frontiers of quantum physics are slowly validating what Hermeticism claimed all along, that consciousness affects reality, that time is not linear, that everything is energy first and form second. A third prophecy spoke of a time when knowledge would be abundant, but wisdom rare. Today we have endless data, infinite information, and yet we are more confused than ever. We scroll, consume, swipe, mistaking quantity for understanding. Hermes warned of this, a world where people would lose the ability to think deeply, to see symbols, to connect the inner world with the outer. We are that world now, and in our ignorance, we call it progress. And then there's the most chilling prediction, that sacred wisdom would not be lost through destruction, but through distortion. Hermes foresaw a future where the ancient truths would be co-opted, commercialized, and repackaged to serve power, where spirituality would become a market, and seekers would be sold watered-down versions of enlightenment. The truth wouldn't be hidden, it would be mocked, it would be everywhere, yet invisible. How many times have you walked past the symbols? The eye, the pyramid, the staff of Hermes, now rebranded as logos, ornaments, corporate emblems, hidden in plain sight. But not everything can be said here. Some of these prophecies are too dangerous to break down here. That's why we've started a free newsletter called Insights Academy, where we go deeper into the predictions too controversial for YouTube. Right now, you'll also get a free copy of the Hermetic classic, the Kybalion. Link in the description. As we revisit these 30 predictions one by one, the question isn't whether they came true. The question is, how did they know? Because what these prophecies reveal isn't just a future, they outline a cycle, a pattern of forgetting and remembering, destruction and rebirth. And Hermes warned that the deeper the world descends into confusion, the closer we come to the moment of awakening, but only for those with eyes to see. As above, so below. You've heard the phrase, but most people repeat it without ever grasping what it really means. It's not just poetic. It's not just spiritual. It's a key, an encoded truth about how reality works, and how history doesn't repeat by chance. It repeats because the same patterns are playing out across every layer of existence. What happens in the stars reflects what happens on Earth. What happens in your mind reflects what happens in the world. Hermes didn't just speak in metaphors. He laid out a cosmological system where inner and outer, spirit and matter, past and future are entangled. And once you understand that, history no longer looks random. It looks scripted. One of the core Hermetic predictions was that humanity would repeat the rise and fall of civilizations again and again until it finally learned the deeper lesson. Not technological advancement, not military strength, but inner alignment with natural law. He described cycles of forgetting, where truth would be buried beneath illusion, and the collective consciousness would sink into spiritual darkness. And then, always, a return, a remembering, a rebalancing, the fall of empires, not because of external enemies, but because they turned away from the eternal laws that govern all things. Sound familiar? The fall of Rome wasn't just historical, it was archetypal. Hermes warned that when societies lose connection to the divine, when law becomes corrupted, when truth becomes relative and morality becomes entertainment, the collapse is inevitable. Look at today's Western world. Divided, distracted, addicted to convenience and spectacle. We believe we've evolved past the empires of the past, but what if we're simply playing out the same pattern with faster Wi-Fi and louder distractions? There's a reason why Hermeticism placed such emphasis on planetary alignments, astrological ages, and celestial movements. Not because the stars control us like puppets, but because they reflect the currents of consciousness flowing through our reality. As above, so below, was a warning. When the planets shift, so do we. When the outer cosmos enters a new rhythm, so does human behavior. It's not superstition, it's resonance. Think of it like a spiritual tide. You can ignore the moon, but it still pulls the ocean. Hermes foresaw the return of chaos as both necessary and sacred. He described a world that would unravel itself, not out of punishment, but preparation. Before each awakening, there would be disorder. Before remembering, there would be forgetting. That's where we are now. A society unraveling. The institutions are cracking. The systems are failing. But perhaps they were never meant to last. Perhaps their destruction was the prelude to something greater. Hermes didn't just predict the fall, he predicted what comes after. Among the 30 prophecies, one in particular stands out, that humanity would try to conquer nature, only to become enslaved by its own creations. The prediction was symbolic, yes, but also literal. What is artificial intelligence, if not a mirror of human thought, now growing beyond our control? What is climate change, if not the response of a planet pushed past balance by those who thought they could dominate it? Hermetic wisdom warned, any force out of harmony with universal law will correct itself. And correction doesn't always come gently. We like to believe that we're at the peak of evolution, but Hermes saw it differently. He saw us in a cycle, a spiral, moving forward, yes, but through destruction, through crisis, through ego death. That's why these prophecies aren't about doom, they're about timing. If you understand the rhythm, you stop fearing the chaos. You see it for what it is, the cleansing before clarity, the unraveling before realignment. As above, so below isn't just an idea. It's a mirror. And if you dare to look into it, you'll see that the world you're living in isn't falling apart, it's falling into place. Hermes warned there would come a time when humanity would worship machines more than the divine, when the soul would be dismissed as superstition and consciousness would be reduced to code. That time isn't coming, it's already here. Look around you. The average person spends more time looking at a screen than they do looking within. We've built a world of efficiency, connection, and speed, but we've lost depth, stillness, and meaning. And what Hermetic prophecy described isn't the end of the world. It's the end of the human spirit as we once knew it. In one passage from the Hermetic text Asclepius, there's a chilling statement. There will come a time when it will be thought a crime to be spiritual, and those who seek the divine will be ridiculed as mad. What seemed unthinkable centuries ago is now a daily reality. Talk about energy, soul, or spiritual truth in the wrong circles, and you'll be labeled delusional, irrational, or worse, dangerous. Science has become the new dogma, and those who challenge it are heretics. But Hermeticism never rejected science. It simply refused to separate it from spirit. This prophecy didn't name Silicon Valley, but its fingerprints are unmistakable. Hermes foresaw a world where humans would try to replicate intelligence in matter, a mirror of the divine mind, but forget the spirit that animates it. Artificial intelligence is not evil, but the blind worship of it is. We treat it as the next savior, the next oracle, the next god. It answers faster than we can think. It predicts what we'll do before we do it. But Hermes would have asked, who is programming the machine? And more importantly, what kind of consciousness is it reflecting? Another Hermetic warning speaks of a world where humanity loses its inner compass, led not by intuition but by algorithm, where instead of listening to the self, we obey signals, notifications, vibrations, commands from devices that promise connection but deliver control. This wasn't fantasy, it was forewarning. We are becoming more machine-like in our habits and less human in our hearts. Automation is replacing reflection, convenience is replacing wisdom, and in the process, we are outsourcing our very being. One of the 30 Hermetic prophecies described a world where the physical would become so dominant that the spiritual would seem absurd, where pleasure would replace purpose, where stimulation would replace insight. And the irony is, we believe we're more evolved because we've conquered nature, because we can simulate reality, but we've lost something deeper. Hermes spoke of this as the great inversion, where what is sacred becomes mocked and what is hollow becomes glorified. You can see it in our art, in our entertainment, in the way we talk about ourselves. We no longer speak of destiny or meaning. We speak of productivity, growth, and optimization. We measure worth in metrics. We define success by output, and we call it progress. But this wasn't progress to Hermes. This was collapse, not of infrastructure, but of the soul. Yet, even in this, the prophecy offers a strange comfort. Hermes didn't predict this fall to frighten us. He predicted it to show us that darkness precedes light. He knew that when the outer world becomes unbearable, the inner world calls louder. That when humanity loses itself, it begins to look for what it lost. This is the paradox of spiritual decline. It always gives birth to the hunger for awakening. We are at that threshold now. You can feel it. The restlessness, the sense that something is deeply wrong even when everything appears normal. Hermes would say that's the signal. The world of form is beginning to fail, and the formless is calling you back. The machine has served its cycle. Now the question is whether we'll remember the spirit before it's too late, or only after everything else collapses. The greatest trick they ever pulled wasn't hiding the truth. It was teaching you not to notice it. Because the Hermetic teachings were never truly erased. They were buried in plain sight. The symbols, the messages, the architecture, even the language, They've always been here, woven into the fabric of your everyday life. You just weren't taught how to read them. Hermes spoke of a future where sacred knowledge would not be burned or destroyed, but distorted and commercialized, turned into tools for control instead of liberation. The Eye of Providence, an ancient symbol of divine insight, is now stamped on your currency, branded on government buildings, and displayed in corporate logos. But ask the average person what it means, and they'll shrug. Or they'll say conspiracy theory, because that's what they were trained to say. The conditioning runs so deep that symbols once meant to awaken are now triggers for dismissal. That wasn't an accident. That was design. The prophecy warned of an era where the language of enlightenment would be stolen by those in power. Words like illumination, light, awakening, they sound spiritual, but they've been repackaged to sell luxury retreats and self-help fads. Meanwhile, the original meaning, the burning inner light of gnosis, is forgotten. Hermes knew this would happen. He said the truth would become entertainment, that the sacred would become aesthetic. And now we scroll through it, double-tapping symbols that once opened minds but now only feed algorithms. The staff of Hermes, the caduceus, is another example. It's used today as the universal symbol of medicine, a sign of healing and knowledge. But in Hermetic tradition, it represents the duality of life, masculine and feminine, spirit and matter, rising up the spine toward enlightenment. It's a map of energy, a diagram of consciousness, a symbol of integration. Yet today it's a logo on hospital doors, stripped of all meaning, used to sell a system that often ignores the very soul Hermes sought to heal. The message was never erased. We just stopped listening. Prediction after prediction from Hermetic texts describe this exact inversion. Symbols that once pointed to higher knowledge would be twisted to serve lower intentions. The pyramid, once a sign of the initiatory path, is now shorthand for control. The all-seeing eye, once representing the divine witness within, is now synonymous with surveillance. This isn't a coincidence. This is what happens when the sacred is captured by the profane. But it goes deeper. Look at architecture. Government buildings lined with columns and domes, echoes of ancient temples. Universities designed like Masonic halls. Courtrooms, banks, even museums, built to invoke reverence, not truth. Why? Because the Hermetic principle of vibration teaches that form shapes perception. If a space feels sacred, we're more likely to submit to its authority. And if we submit without question, control becomes effortless. Even entertainment carries these codes. The hero's journey, the structure of nearly every major film, is based on initiatory cycles found in Hermetic and alchemical texts. Descent, struggle, rebirth. But instead of guiding you to your own awakening, the pattern is used to trap your attention, to keep you emotionally invested in fiction so you don't apply the same lens to your own life. You're meant to identify with the hero, but never realize you are one. Another prophecy fulfilled. Hermes foresaw a future where the world would be filled with signs, but only the awakened would see them. He wrote, "They will have eyes but will not see, ears but will not hear." We are living in that blindness now, and yet blindness is not permanent. It is the stage before vision, the moment before recognition. The truth is, they never needed to erase the Hermetic blueprint. All they had to do was surround you with it, then convince you it meant nothing. But once you begin to see it again, you can't unsee it. You start noticing the patterns. You start decoding the language. You begin to understand that your world is not random, it is layered. And when you see the symbols for what they are, the spell begins to break. You realize you were never powerless. You were just never meant to remember. When Hermes wrote that the all is mind, he wasn't being poetic. He wasn't describing some vague philosophical concept. He was describing the fundamental structure of reality. That everything, matter, time, space, even the laws we think are fixed, originates from consciousness, not as a byproduct of the brain, not as a side effect of biology, but as the root, the source, the observer and the observed. What we now call quantum physics, Hermes called divine science. And he knew that one day, science and spirit would split, but only for a time. Eventually, they'd converge again. And when they did, everything we thought we knew would collapse. One of the Hermetic predictions was that the physical world would eventually lead us back to the metaphysical. That the harder we tried to break reality down into equations, the more we'd stumble onto mysteries we couldn't explain. And that's exactly what's happening now. Look at the double-slit experiment. Observing a particle changes its behavior. Reality shifts based on perception. The observer affects the observed. Hermes said this too, 0 years ago. He just used a different language. He spoke of vibration, frequency, and mentalism. He spoke of cause and effect as law, not just physical law, but spiritual cause, shaping physical consequence. Another prediction said that in the future, humanity would try to simulate reality instead of understand it. And here we are, building digital worlds, creating artificial minds, mimicking consciousness, while still denying it. But the truth is, simulation only works because consciousness creates the framework to begin with. If reality weren't already mental, the simulation wouldn't function. What Hermeticism teaches is that this isn't just a physical universe. It's a dream, a thought, a projection of the collective mind. You're not living in matter, you're living in meaning. Hermes explained that the universe isn't built on solidity. It's built on energy, vibration, resonance. Everything moves, everything vibrates, and everything seeks balance. He called it the law of rhythm. The pendulum swings, not just in politics or economics, but in thought, in energy, in awareness. When you feel like your world is spiraling, when things feel chaotic, it's not just bad luck, it's movement. And movement is the signal of life. Modern science is just starting to whisper what Hermeticism shouted. That time may be non-linear, that the future might already exist, that the mind might not be confined to the brain. But Hermes said all of this long before the first telescope, because he wasn't guessing, he was remembering. That's the core of Hermetic wisdom. It doesn't ask you to believe, it invites you to remember. But that remembering comes with responsibility. If everything is mental, then your thoughts matter more than you think. They're not harmless. They're not private. They're not just background noise. They are the architects of your reality. Every fear you feed, every truth you silence, every desire you hide from becomes part of the field. And that's not meant to scare you. It's meant to empower you. Another of the 30 Hermetic predictions warned of a future where people would hand over their power to external systems, governments, technologies, ideologies, because they forgot the power of their own mind. We're living in that prophecy right now. We outsource our thinking to algorithms, our decisions to systems, our identity to strangers online. We've been taught that power lives out there, when it has always lived within. The Hermetic path isn't about control. It's about mastery, not over others, but over your own state. Your mind is the instrument, the medium, and the message. When you understand this, when you really understand it, you stop reacting and start creating. You stop blaming and start becoming. That's what they don't want you to figure out. Because a person who understands the power of their own mind is dangerous. They don't obey fear. They don't follow blindly. They don't crumble when systems do. They become the system, the new blueprint. The ancients didn't write about consciousness because it was trendy. They did it because it was the secret to everything, the bridge between worlds, the one force they could never control. And that's why they buried it beneath dogma and distraction. But you're not distracted now. You're seeing it, feeling it, remembering it. And that remembering is not just insight, it's initiation. Hermeticism never promised a smooth journey. It warned, again and again, that the road to awakening would be paved with suffering. Not as punishment, but as pressure. The kind of pressure that forges gold from lead, not in a laboratory, but within the soul. That's the true alchemy Hermes spoke of. Not turning metals into treasure, but turning the base elements of the human experience, fear, shame, ego, into awareness, wisdom, and higher consciousness. And according to the prophecies, there would come a time when this transformation would become urgent, when the world would begin to fracture, and only those who understood this inner alchemy would survive with their spirit intact. That time is now, and deep down, you know it. Among the 30 Hermetic predictions is one that stands above the rest, that humanity would lose itself before it could evolve, that it would descend into illusion so completely that most would forget they ever had a soul. They would chase pleasure, fame, comfort. They would mistake noise for meaning and mistake imitation for truth. But from within that darkness, a few would start to wake up. Not because they were better, not because they were chosen, but because the weight of the lie would become unbearable. These people, maybe you, would feel something rising that they couldn't explain. An ache, a knowing, a refusal to keep sleepwalking. Hermes described this phase as the purification stage, the symbolic fire, the moment when the illusion burns away, leaving only what's real. For some, this comes as a crisis, a breakdown, loss, a stripping of identity. For others, it comes quietly, an unease, a sense that the old ways don't work anymore. Either way, it's not comfortable, and it's not meant to be. Alchemy never is. It's a death and a rebirth, the dissolving of who you thought you were to make space for what you truly are. The law of polarity, one of the Hermetic principles, says that everything contains its opposite, that the darkest moment always contains the seed of light. That suffering, if seen clearly, becomes a doorway. That's what most people miss. They think awakening is light and peace. But the truth is, the first stage is almost always chaos. Because to wake up, you have to face what you've been avoiding. You have to meet the parts of yourself the system taught you to ignore. Your rage, your doubt, your longing for something more. This is the work. This is the turning of lead into gold. And the world doesn't teach you how to do it. Because a person who completes that process is no longer controllable. Hermes knew this process wouldn't be easy. But he also knew it was inevitable. That when the outer world became hollow, the inner world would call. That call is ancient, and it's getting louder. You hear it in your restlessness. You feel it when the achievements don't satisfy you. You sense it when the path laid out for you feels like a cage. This is the soul pushing against the programming, the signal that the transformation has already begun. One of the prophecies described this moment as a split in the human timeline, a fork in the road. Some would double down on distraction, on denial, on comfort. Others would take the risk, the terrifying, liberating risk of looking inward. And those who did would begin to access something that was never lost, only buried. The knowledge that they are more than their name, their job, their body. That they are the living expression of a cosmic law. That they are here not just to survive the system, but to outgrow it. This is what makes Hermetic alchemy different from self-help. It doesn't tell you to become better at the game. It tells you to walk away from it entirely. Not to reject the world, but to transform your relationship with it. To stop being a pawn and start being a creator. To stop reacting and start remembering. Because the moment you remember what you are, you change the frequency of everything around you. You stop feeding the machine, and you start feeding your soul. That's the prophecy. Not doom, not escape, but evolution. The question is, will you resist the fire, or will you let it forge you? One of the most sobering Hermetic prophecies spoke not of a fiery apocalypse or divine judgment, but of something quieter, more insidious. It warned of a time when truth would be rejected, not because it was disproven, but because it was inconvenient. A time when the world would turn against itself, denying its own nature, mocking the sacred, and celebrating the artificial. Hermes didn't describe an external enemy. He described a collapse from within, a sickness of spirit disguised as progress. And he said that in this time, those who saw clearly would be silenced, ridiculed, or simply ignored. Look around. We've created a world that worships distraction. We scroll for hours and call it connection. We parrot slogans and call it thinking. We consume constantly and call it freedom. And the people who pause, who question, who seek, who refuse to comply, they're called crazy, extremist, or irrelevant. Hermes predicted this inversion, that light would be called darkness, and darkness would be called light, that the wise would be branded fools, and the fools would be handed the microphone. We've entered the age of spiritual dissonance, not because people lack access to truth, but because they've been trained to reject it. This was part of the prophecy, that the more disconnected we became from the divine spark within us, the more hostile we'd become to anything that reminded us it existed, not out of malice, but out of fear. Because when you've built your identity on illusion, truth feels like violence, and so it's avoided, or worse, attacked. Hermes foresaw a future where censorship wouldn't come only through force, but through algorithms, through invisible filters deciding what you see, what you hear, and what you never even know existed. The voice of truth doesn't need to be silenced when it can simply be buried, drowned in noise, buried under 1,000 trending distractions. You've felt it. That sense that the conversations that matter are always happening just out of reach, that the content that speaks to your soul is shadow banned, while nonsense goes viral. That's not your imagination. That's the system working as designed. But perhaps the most haunting part of this prophecy is what it said about morality. That in this inverted age, good would no longer be understood as alignment with truth, but as obedience to the collective lie. That kindness would be used to justify censorship. That inclusion would be weaponized to destroy individuality. That compassion would be rebranded as control. All under the banner of progress. And yet, Hermes didn't share this to scare us. He shared it to prepare us, because he also said that those who could see clearly during this time would carry a power the world had forgotten, the power of inner authority, the ability to know what's true, not because it's popular, but because it resonates. That power is rare, and that's why the system fears it. Because a person who sees through the illusion cannot be steered by it. Hermes said the age of denial would end when enough people remembered, not remembered facts, but remembered essence. That they are not the sum of what society told them to be, that they are not here to play roles, meet quotas, or repeat slogans. They are here to witness, to awaken, to restore balance. And balance does not come from agreeing with everyone. It comes from aligning with truth, even when it's unpopular, even when it's dangerous. If you've ever felt the pressure to stay silent when your soul screamed to speak, you've lived this prophecy. If you've ever swallowed your truth to avoid being labeled, you've touched its edge. But here's what Hermes knew. That pressure isn't meant to crush you. It's meant to forge you, to test the strength of your spirit, to ask, will you trade your voice for comfort? Or will you become a beacon, no matter the cost? Because that's the real test. Not whether you know the truth, but whether you'll live it. And in this age of denial, doing so is nothing short of revolutionary. Hermes didn't leave us with prophecy to paralyze us. He left it as a map, cryptic, symbolic, layered, but a map nonetheless. And like any map, it only becomes useful when you realize where you are. The signs of collapse, the rise of false idols, the distortion of truth, all of these are not endpoints. They're thresholds, doorways. And the moment you begin to see the pattern, to feel the rhythm, to understand that the external world reflects an internal reality, you reclaim the one thing the system worked so hard to make you forget: your power. One of the last Hermetic predictions said that those who remembered, even in fragments, would begin to turn the tide. Not by fighting the system head-on, but by withdrawing from its frequency. The moment you shift your perception, you stop feeding the illusion. You stop reacting to the distractions. You stop seeking approval from structures built to keep you small. And in that silence, that sacred gap, a new blueprint begins to emerge. One not based on control, but on principle. Not on dogma, but on natural law. Hermetic law was never about belief. It was about alignment. understanding the principles that govern reality so you can live in harmony with them. The law of mentalism, all is mind. The law of correspondence, as above, so below. The law of vibration, nothing rests, everything moves. The law of polarity, everything has its pair. The law of rhythm, everything flows in and out. The law of cause and effect, nothing escapes consequence. The law of gender, creation needs both forces. These weren't suggestions. They were the operating system of the universe. Once you begin to live in alignment with these laws, life stops being something that happens to you. It becomes something you participate in. And that participation is the antidote to helplessness. The world tells you you're one of 8 billion, a number, a user, a stat. But Hermeticism tells you something else, that you are a fractal of the whole, that your mind, when aligned, becomes a tuning fork for change, that the vibration you carry shifts the field around you, that your thoughts are creative forces, not private noise. We are taught to change the world by force, protest, resist, destroy. But Hermes taught something different. That change begins in consciousness, that when enough people change their inner state, the outer world adjusts. That doesn't mean passive compliance. It means sovereign action, not reaction, not panic, but deliberate recalibration. Because when your inner world stabilizes, the outer chaos loses its grip on you. We've been programmed to think power is about dominance, but true power is clarity. It's knowing your value without needing validation. It's standing in truth when it's unpopular. It's walking a path that can't be mapped by algorithms or sanctioned by systems. That's what the initiates understood. That's what the ancient temples trained people for. Not to rule others, but to rule themselves. And now, that initiation is returning. Not through secret societies or ancient rites, but through crisis, through longing, through the silent moments when the old life stops making sense and something deeper starts to stir. That stirring is not confusion. It's the beginning of remembrance. And the more you align with the Hermetic principles, the clearer it becomes. You don't need to burn down the system. You just need to stop feeding it with your belief, your fear, your silence. If you've come this far, then something in you is already shifting. You're not waiting for permission. You're not asking to be saved. You're remembering that reality bends when awareness deepens. That's what this was always about. Not decoding prophecies for the sake of it, but for the practice of it, for living differently, thinking differently, choosing differently. Because once you align with the blueprint, you don't just escape the illusion, you begin to rewrite it. Hermes spoke of a time not just of collapse or awakening, but of remembering, a cycle closing, a return, not to old systems or forgotten temples, but to the eternal truths that were never lost, only buried. He called it the Great Remembering, and said it would happen not when the world was ready, but when enough individuals became unable to pretend anymore. When the illusion would crack under its own weight, and the real would rise, not as a revolution, but as a revelation. This final prophecy wasn't about a date or a disaster. It was about a shift in frequency, a change in perception so deep it would alter the structure of reality itself. And the trigger for that shift wouldn't come from governments, institutions, or artificial intelligence. It would come from within, a spark in the individual, a pattern breaking, a story rewritten. That's the secret buried in the last of the 30 Hermetic predictions, that the moment you choose to wake up, the world begins to change with you. Right now, the world feels uncertain, fragile, loud, but if you listen closely, beneath the noise, there's a current moving, a hum, a rhythm. You feel it in moments of silence, in synchronicities too precise to dismiss, in the way certain words, symbols, or ideas seem to find you exactly when you're ready. That's not a coincidence. That's resonance, and it's happening more and more to those who are paying attention. Hermes described this as the beginning of the return of the Hermetists. Not a religion, not a group, but a frequency, a state of mind. Those who feel it don't always have the language for it. They just know the old path isn't working. They know success feels empty, and the news sounds scripted. They know the narrative is broken, and the systems are cracked. And they're not looking for a new belief. They're searching for what was always true. That is the remembering. And once it begins, nothing fits the same way again. You start to notice the way your thoughts shape your experience, the way people reflect your energy back to you, the way patterns repeat until you choose to break them. You stop asking for signs and start becoming one. And the moment you do, the Hermetic teachings come alive, not as dusty philosophies, but as living truths woven through your choices, your awareness, your presence. This is the moment Hermes foresaw. Not the end of the world, but the end of forgetting. A mass remembering, happening one individual at a time. And you're here for a reason, not by accident, not by chance, but because something in you was ready to remember too. If you've made it this far, then you already know you're not like everyone else. The deeper truths can't be shared openly, but in our free newsletter, Insights Academy, we go where the platforms won't let us. Sign up now and receive the Kabbalion, completely free, for a limited time. Because when this moment in history is looked back on, it won't be remembered for what collapsed, but for what began. A quiet return to eternal law. A collective spark of truth in a world that forgot what truth was. You don't need to fight the system when you understand that your very existence, lived fully and freely, disrupts everything it was built on. You are not the audience of these prophecies. You are the fulfillment of them. If this video resonated with you, let us know by commenting, "I understood it."